good evening, everybody, from wherever you may be joining us tonight on live stream, and also to all of you present here. You may be seated. A warm welcome on this very, very cold night. I hope you've each had a glass of sherry outside just to warm up a little bit. I'm also sure that we will have a lovely inaugural address tonight, which will also warm us up even further. As I said, a warm welcome to everybody. In particular, I would like to welcome Professor Stevens. A more detailed welcome will be extended to you by the DVC shortly. I also want to welcome the Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Law, Professor Charles Maimela. I also want to welcome the Head of Department of Public Law, Professor Zozo Diani Mango. And then colleagues of the faculty, friends, family, loved ones, a warm welcome to all of you. I now want to call on Professor Norman Duncan, the DVC and Vice Principal Academic, to introduce Professor Stevens to you. Professor Duncan, please.
Professor Elizabeth Skuman, Dean of the Faculty of Law, Professor Charles Maimela, the Deputy Dean of the Faculty, Professor Zozo Dianimangu, Head of the Department of Public Law, other academics from the University of Pretoria, as well as colleagues from other institutions, Professor Philip Stevens, and Professor Stevens' family and friends, particularly his sister, Vicky Stevens, and his father, Advocate Geert Stevens, and then, of course, online audience. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is my signal pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural lecture of Professor Philip Stevens. Colleagues, I remind you that an inaugural lecture represents one of the most important milestones in the careers of academics, as it provides them with the opportunity to inform the university community and academia more broadly about their academic journeys. More specifically, it provides an opportunity for newly appointed or promoted professors to share with us their research to date, as well as the direction in which they hope to steer their research in future. Above all, for us at the University of Pretoria, an inaugural lecture provides the university with an opportunity to showcase and celebrate the academic achievements of the professor presenting the inaugural lecture. Importantly, too, an inaugural lecture provides us with an opportunity to acknowledge one of the most important milestones in an academic's career, namely being elevated to the level of full professor. And as such, it offers us an opportunity to congratulate the academic for her or his achievements. So, Professor Stevens, my sincerest congratulations with your achievements and this signal moment in your career. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, allow me now to introduce Professor Stevens to you. Professor Philip Stevens obtained the degrees LLB cum laude in 2002 and the LLM degree also cum laude in 2004 at the University of Pretoria. In 2011, he obtained the LLD in Criminal Law and Mental Health Law, also at the University of Pretoria. The title of his doctoral thesis was The Role of Expert Evidence in Support of the Defense of Criminal Incapacity. The thesis focused on the essential interaction between criminal law and mental health law. While completing his postgraduate studies, Professor Stevens was employed as an academic associate in the departments of jurisprudence and procedural law at his alma mater. He subsequently lectured in criminal law and criminal procedure at the University of South Africa, or UNISA. In 2009, Professor Stevens was admitted as an advocate of the High Court, and in 2010, he was called to the Pretoria Bar to serve his pupillage. Professor Stevens subsequently practiced as an advocate at the Pretoria Bar. In 2012, he joined the Department of Public Law here at the University of Pretoria, and 5 years later, he was promoted to associate professor, and in 2020, he was promoted to full professor on the basis of his singularly impressive performance as a scholar. Worth noting is that with his promotion, Professor Stevens became one of a fairly small group of academics of 40 years or younger in the professoriate. Professor Stevens currently lectures in criminal law and statutory crimes. He has authored more than 40 scholarly publications, including peer-reviewed publications in international and national journals, and as well as various chapters in textbooks and other scholarly books. Professor Stevens is a National Research Foundation C2 rated researcher. Furthermore, he has presented papers and keynote addresses at several national and international conferences and is a member of the South African Medico-Legal Society and the International Academy of Law and Mental Health. Professor Stevens was the editor-in-chief of the law journal, De Jure, and has served on the Faculty of Law's Ethics Committee, the Research Ethics Committee of the Faculty of Health Sciences, and the Disciplinary Appeals Committee of Senate. Last but not least, Professor Stevens has supervised several master's and doctoral students to the successful completion of their studies. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is now my distinct pleasure to invite Professor Stevens to present his inaugural lecture titled Criminal Law in the Wake of Science, From Antiquity to Beyond, Can Science Inform Criminal Law? Medico-Legal Perspectives from South Africa. Over to you, Prof. Stevens. And please welcome him with a warm round of applause.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this inaugural address. It's truly heartwarming to see all my people here tonight. I hope to captivate you for about 40 to 45 minutes with my inaugural address, dealing with a topic which has been of great interest to me of late and a little pet hobby that I have on the side in terms of research, dealing specifically with the role of neuroscience and how it can explain criminal behavior, both in terms of criminal responsibility and also in terms of sentencing aspects. For purposes of this inaugural address, I will, however, limit it to criminal responsibility. Otherwise, I will keep you busy for the whole evening. Thank you, everyone who are here tonight, my family and everyone. For convenience, I will leave the acknowledgements for the end of my presentation. Without further ado, I will then commence with my discussion dealing with neuroscience in criminal law and how neuroscience can inform or possibly inform criminal law in terms of explaining criminal behavior. In terms of commencing, the words of Garland and Frankel come to mind, where they state that if our brains are determined and if the brain is a necessary and sufficient organ that enables the mind, then we are left with the question, are the thoughts that arise from our mind also determined? Is the free will we seem to experience just an illusion? Must we revise our concept of what it means to be personally responsible for our actions? The format of this presentation will entail, firstly, introduction, then a discussion of criminal law in the wake of science, reflections on the emerging nature of neuroscience. Then we will commence with neuroscience and criminal responsibility, some selected areas of application, but the defense of pathological criminal incapacity in South African criminal law and how neuroscience has an impact on that defense, more commonly referred to as the insanity defense. The scientific reliability and validity of neuroscientific evidence, the risks and limitations of neuroscientific evidence, diminished responsibility, followed by a conclusion. Chris Benoit had everything a man could dream of in the world. Not only had he become a professional wrestler at the age of 18 and a world champion at the age of 25, but also had a loving family who was devoted to and loved spending time with. It all seemed perfect until the fateful day in June 2007, when police discovered that Benoit had bound his wife's wrists and feet, strangled her to death, and suffocated their 7-year-old son. While searching their home, police discovered Benoit's body dangling from a weightlifting machine in the home's basement. The tragedy sent shockwaves through family, friends, and fans worldwide, as everyone battled to grasp what had caused Benoit to act in the manner in which he did. Desperate to find answers for his son's bloodbath, Benoit's father requested requested Dr. Julian Bailey's chief of neurosurgery at West Virginia University to examine his son's brain. Dr. Bailey's and neuropathologist Dr. Bennett Amalu accordingly dissected portions of Benoit's brain and discovered the effects of repetitive head trauma, which consisted of brown staining over all areas of the brain indicative of dead nerve cells or dead neurons. The two specialists indicated that it had been one of the worst cases of head trauma they had ever seen. In June 2011, in New South Wales, Australia, 35-year-old Taskin Aslan approached a female as she was on her way to a hotel. Aslan grabbed her by the shoulders and forced her towards the entrance of a church. Aslan then sexually assaulted her, the complainant. It was later discovered that Aslan was abused as a child by his alcoholic father and had started using drugs at the age of 12. At the age of 18, Aslan had a lengthy criminal history, and in his mid-20s, Aslan had been involved in 2 motor vehicle accidents, after which neurological assessments revealed brain damage. A clinical neuropsychologist reported that Aslan's dysfunction in executive control, which included lack of inhibition, had been consistent with post-concussional disorder associated with brain injury. In 2012, a psychiatrist, Dr. Al-Nat, stated that Aslan possibly suffered ongoing cognitive difficulties due to head injuries, which included impulsivity and poor judgment. These facts serve to set the stage for the theme of this address, which deals with the role of neuroscience in explaining criminal behavior. Few things are as intricate and difficult to comprehend as the human mind and psyche. Traditionally, whenever the mental state of an accused person is assessed, either to assess criminal responsibility or in terms of possible mitigation or aggravation of punishment, the law has turned to the forensic psychiatric psychology model for plausible answers. Science and law have one common characteristic. They are both in a constant state of evolution. Benoit and Aslan's cases, as unique as the facts were, provides an illustration of an alternative explanation in respect of the possible cause of their criminal behavior, ultimately taking a different route as opposed to the classic forensic psychology model in terms of assessing for mental illness, specifically in cases where mental illness giving rise to the insanity defense is claimed. Recently, science and more specifically neuroscientific research has made significant advancements in understanding the brain and is becoming increasingly useful in advancing our comprehension of the neural correlates of human behavior, cognition, and emotion, and could potentially become highly significant when criminal responsibility falls to be assessed. Neuroscience is making significant advancements in terms of explaining how the circuits and logic of neurons carry out action. The question which inevitably arises is, can neuroscience inform criminal law in terms of assessing criminal responsibility, as well as predicting future dangerousness in dangerous criminals? Should courts become more receptive to neuroscientific evidence as an alternative explanation to criminal behavior? One of the primary fields where neuroscience could find application is in respect of criminal responsibility. There are principally 3 areas of brain abnormalities that are of significance for purposes of assessing criminal responsibility, which include impairments of the frontal lobes, abnormalities in the limbic system with associated problems in affective processing, and potential adverse effects of neurotechnology's control. The advancements within the field of neuroscience raise fundamental questions which could be of relevance also within the field of South African criminal law. The interaction between neuroscience and law has been coined neurolaw, which classically deals with the interplay between the legal system and advancements made within the field of neuroscience. In this address, the emerging nature of neuroscience will be addressed within the context of South African criminal law, with specific reference to its applicability to different levels of criminal liability. Criminal law in the wake of science, reflections on the emerging nature and context of neuroscience. Recently, significant advancements have been made in cognitive neuroscience in terms of understanding the brain. Neuroscience has advanced to the level where it is increasingly being used to explain an offender's mental state, or alternatively to assess potential future dangerousness and recidivism in criminals. At first glance, the interface between law and neuroscience seems relatively simple. But the reality is that the language of law differs vastly from the language of neuroscience. There are generally two functions of neuroscience in law which relate to the deepening of psychological knowledge pertaining to criminal behavior and to establish new tools in order to curtail recidivism or to establish direct brain interventions. In its current state, neuroscience has not yet developed to such an extent as to assess causation between an accused's brain dysfunction and the commission of a crime in order to absolve an offender of criminal responsibility. In this address, the role of neuroscience in criminal law is addressed from the perspective that neuroscience can inform criminal law on certain aspects which fall outside the normal mental health assessment model in order to better comprehend criminal behavior. As such, neuroscience can supplement forensic psychiatric and psychological evidence in criminal trials. Morse and Newsom correctly state that a neuroscientific causal explanation for criminal conduct, like any other type of causal explanation, does not per se mitigate or excuse. It only provides evidence that might help the law resolve whether genuine excuse existed or that might be a guide to prophylactic or rehabilitative measures. Cognitive neuroscience is generally defined as the field of scientific endeavor that is trying to understand how the brain enables the mind, and as such involves the analysis of the structure and function of the brain. With the use of functional magnetic resonance imaging, brain function can be assessed in order to view images of which parts of the brain are active when a person engages in certain activities. fMRI is used to detect changes associated with blood flow in the brain. Primarily, fMRI assesses fluctuations in the amount of oxygen in the blood passing through the brain as a result of neural activity. Functional brain imaging is, however, not mind reading. Roskis also correctly points out that brains change with age and time and do not remain static. And accordingly, if a scan is performed months or years after an offense and an abnormality appears, it is not necessarily proof that the abnormality existed when the offense was committed. The intersections between modern neuroscience and the law can generally be divided into three subsections: the law of neuroscience, neuroscience and the law, and neuroscience in law. The first level refers to the regulation of neuroscientific research with an emphasis on aspects such as informed consent and also aspects relating to research involving human participants. The second level of neurolaw refers to the neuroscience relating to normative judgment and decision-making. The third level, which is topical for purposes of this address, refers to the study of cognition and behavioral patterns relevant for legal purposes, which include impulse control, moral reasoning, and psychopathy, as well as drug addiction. As such, one of the primary fields of application of neuroscience within the context of the third category refers to the possibility of assessing for criminal responsibility. The question which arises in respect of the role of neuroscience in assessing criminal responsibility is, if neuroscientific research indicates abnormal brain functioning of an accused in terms of, for example, lacking impulse control, whether such accused can be held criminally responsible for his or her actions. Claiming and Coops note that neuroscientific evidence has been used in various cases to argue for diminished responsibility, in the Netherlands, for example. Shane, in addition, stated that neuroscience has been used, amongst others, by the courts in the following ways. Brain data has been utilized to indicate personality changes after head trauma. Brain scans have been used to assess competency to stand trial. Brain scans have been used in mitigation of sentence where there is evidence of brain trauma. It has also been utilized in cases involving sexual offenses, and neuroimaging evidence has been used in support of insanity cases. It is from the outset important to note that neuroscientific evidence can be employed by both prosecution and defense. In a criminal trial, neuroscience can, for example, be used to indicate potential future dangerousness of an accused. Page also notes that advancements in respect of brain imaging provide objective, reliable information about the structural and functional aspects of the brain, which may assist judges in comprehending an offender's state of mind. As such, cognitive neuroscience can potentially address two aspects of criminal responsibility, namely intention and also the insanity defense. Neuroscience essentially deals with the human brain and seeks to enhance the understanding of how human behavior, and as such also criminal behavior, is influenced by the brain. Compton notes in respect of neurological research that if researchers can use neuroimages to show a direct relationship between the brain and mental and behavioral processes, neuroscience could impact the legal analysis of personal responsibility for past actions, assessment of a person's existing state of mind, and prediction of future behavior. Neuroscience provides interesting possibilities of science being able to reveal the intricate workings of a person's mind. Compton also correctly cautions that the brain is a highly complex system, and science has only begun to comprehend the structure and functioning of the brain and the ultimate effect on behavioral processes. Neuroscientific evidence will essentially entail neuroimaging, which entails computer-generated images of the brain and is utilized to describe both structural and functional images. Experts will essentially employ computer tomography, the CT scanning, and magnetic resonance imaging. These techniques can typically expose physical abnormalities caused by trauma or brain disease, and is often supported for its use as evidence as it depicts the physical observable structures of the brain. More recent forms of neuroimaging, with reference to the functional MRI measure or fMRI, measure the functioning of the brain by locating active brain areas, by measuring the blood flow to a particular section of the brain. The CT and MRI scans depict black and white pictures of the brain structure, whereas the fMRI scans indicate localized changes in blood flow. The latter is then displayed on a three-dimensional computer-generated image of the brain to provide a comprehensive exposition of the functioning and structure of the brain. Due to the novel nature of fMRI technology, CT and MRI images are mainly or primarily utilized to indicate structural abnormalities of the brain itself. Research further indicates that neuroscience evidence has been admitted in criminal trials mainly for purposes of sentencing, but has recently made strides during the assessment of guilt for purposes of establishing criminal responsibility as well. The use of neuroscientific evidence in criminal trials, more specifically in terms of assessing criminal responsibility, raises concerns relating to its scientific reliability and validity. It could, however, be argued that this evidence should nevertheless be admitted in conjunction with forensic psychiatric and psychological evidence in order to best portray an accused's mental structure. Then the curious case of Stefania Albertani, a classic example of how neuroscience can inform criminal law. In 2009, Stefania Albertani approached the police to report fraud which allegedly had been committed by her sister. During the same time, Albertani reported the disappearance of her sister. A few months later, Albertani, during the course of an argument, attempted to strangle her mother and was arrested. Albertani was later charged for various offenses, which included kidnapping and murder of her sister, attempted murder of both her parents, and the attempted strangulation of her mother. A psychiatric assessment was requested by the defense. The outcome of the assessment entailed the existence of a psychotic pathology in the accused. The outcome of the assessment revealed that the accused had been psychotic for quite a while. The presiding judge viewed the expertise of the first psychiatric assessment as incomplete and ordered a second psychiatric assessment, which, in contrast to the first assessment, concluded that despite the presence of certain dissociative disturbances in the accused, coupled with her histrionic personality, she had been in full possession of her mental faculties at the time of the commission of the crimes. The defense then requested a third assessment by a different team of experts, who subjected the accused to a series of psychiatric, neuropsychological tests, as well as neuroscientific and genetic analyses. The EEG results, as well as the VBM results, which entails techniques based on structured MRI, revealed a lack of integrity and functionality of the interior circulate, cortex, and the insula, which, according to the experts, established evidence of the existence of an obsessive-compulsive disorder, which predisposed the accused to aggressive behavior. The experts concluded that the accused had not acted in full possession of her mental faculties at the time of the offense. In delivering judgment, the presiding judge made certain observations on the role that neuroscience should play during criminal proceedings. The presiding judge emphasized the fundamental epistemological limitations of classic psychiatric evaluations, where subjectivity could often prevent psychiatrists from establishing a diagnosis of mental pathology in a precise, objective, and reliable fashion. The presiding judge held that neurogenetic evidence could be a very useful tool in order to establish a more objective evaluation of the degree of criminal responsibility, as well as the risk of future criminal behavior. The judge concluded that the classic psychiatric approach based on behavioral sciences would not be replaced by neuroscience and genetics, but that their integration into psychiatric expertise enhanced the objectivity of expert assessment. The accused was found guilty, but with diminished responsibility. Then neuroscience and criminal responsibility, selected areas of application. With the emergence of neuroscientific research, the question which arises is within which domains the evidence can become relevant for purposes of assessing criminal responsibility. Climbing and Coops indicate that research on criminal responsibility has indicated a link between frontal lobe dysfunction and criminal behavior, as well as limbic dysfunction and criminal behavior. Research indicates that damage to either of the latter brain regions could indicate pathologically disturbed mental capacities, potentially resulting in a finding of diminished responsibility or even non-responsibility. For purposes of this address, emphasis will be placed on these two dysfunctions as examples of where neuroscience could find application with reference to criminal responsibility. Frontal lobe dysfunction and criminal behavior. Frontal lobe brain dysfunction has long been identified as a potential causal factor in violent crimes. Reading notes that neuropsychological research indicate that the prevalence of brain dysfunction among criminal populations is very high, with the highest propensity of 94% among homicide offenders, 61% in respect of habitually aggressive adult offenders, 49 to 78 in respect of sex offenders, and 76% among juvenile offenders. In respect of sex offenders research indicates that murderers generally have lower glucose metabolism in their prefrontal cortex, which in turn indicates that prefrontal deficits in antisocial individuals could potentially predispose them to higher impulsivity and inhibited self-control. As such, dysfunctions in areas of the frontal cortex can impact on an individual's ability to control impulses and deliberate as to the consequences of their behavior. Damage to the frontal lobes can be caused by mild or traumatic brain injuries or even a brain tumor. A typical example of the latter would be the factual scenarios depicted at the outset of this address. Reading postulates that frontal lobe damage often result in changes in personality, mood, as well as behavioral changes, ultimately resulting in frontal lobe dysfunction or frontal lobe syndrome. And typical symptoms associated with frontal lobe disorder include, inter alia, defects in goal determination, defects in planning behavior, violent behavior as a result of flat effect, low frustration tolerance, impaired self-control, low conformance with societal values, as well as sexual disinhibition. Research indicates that brain imaging studies have pertinently revealed structural and functional abnormalities in the frontal lobes of violent as well as psychopathic individuals. Frontal lobe dysfunction is typified by at least two distinct forms, namely damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for impulsive behavior and aggression, and damage to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, resulting in impaired judgment and moral deliberation. Reading notes that numerous symptoms of antisocial personality disorder are consistent with the symptoms of frontal lobe dysfunction. Similarly, the development of psychopathy may in selected cases be traced to frontal lobe damage early in life. It is also notable that the frontal lobes contain the brain's primary serotonergic projections, and as such, abnormalities in serotonin metabolism may lead to impulsive aggression. In order to better comprehend the pivotal role of the prefrontal cortex, the work of Dr. Adrian Raine, a professor of criminology, psychiatry, and psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, deserves some discussion. Raine is a leading expert relating to the biological origins of violence and was also the first individual to perform brain imaging studies on murderers. During 1994, Raine measured the functional capacity of the brains of 41 murderers by utilizing the PET scan, which as an imaging tool assesses brain function and establishes how different portions of the brain metabolize glucose. Ryan's study established the first brain imaging evidence which indicated that the brains of a larger group of murderers differed in functionality from those of the general population. Ryan's study revealed that the 41 murderers showed a vast reduction in prefrontal glucose metabolism when compared with the control group, indicative of a reduction in activation. The latter abnormality in the prefrontal cortex is characterized on various levels. On an emotional level, a reduction in prefrontal cortex functioning results in loss of control over the limbic system, which is responsible for controlling emotions such as anger and rage. On a behavioral level, individuals with prefrontal cortex impairment display an increase in risk-taking and irresponsibility. On a personality level, prefrontal cortex impairment is associated with impulsivity, loss of control, and inability to inhibit certain behaviors. On a cognitive level, prefrontal cortex impairment can manifest as a loss of intellectual flexibility and result in poor problem-solving abilities. It is as such clear that an impaired prefrontal cortex functioning could predispose an individual to violence. And despite there being various brain areas which could predispose an individual to violence, the prefrontal cortex is the region most indicative of violence when dysfunctional. Ryan correctly acknowledges the limitation of neuroscience and states that the antisocial brain is but a patchwork of dysfunctional neural systems, and we are only just on the threshold of putting together these neural pieces to better understand it. Limbic system dysfunction and criminal behavior. Research on psychopathy strongly suggests that psychopathic individuals have decreased activity in the limbic system, which comprises of a structure situated in the middle of the brain, which includes the hippocampus, hypothalamus, and amygdala. And as such, the limbic system is involved in various functions, including the regulation of emotion. As such, some researchers believe that as a result of neurological research, psychopathy is as much a mental illness as any other mental illness, such as schizophrenia, for example. The words of Ryan comes to mind where he states that brain imaging research on violence and psychopathy is troubling to some because it challenges the way we conceptualize crime. It questions our treatment of violent criminals in just the same way that we look back 200 years and question the way in which the mentally ill were kept in shackles and chains, treated little better than animals. The history of civilization has shown that as time progresses, society becomes more ennobled, wiser, and humane. In 200 years from now, will we have reconceptualized serious criminal behavior as a clinical disorder with its roots in early social, biological, and genetic forces beyond the individual's control? Then a conceptual analysis of the defense of pathological criminal incapacity within the context of neuroscience. It is from the outset important to provide a brief prelude to the definition of the defense of pathological criminal incapacity as it currently operates within South African criminal law. Within the South African criminal law context, the defense of pathological criminal incapacity is embodied and defined in Section 78(1) of the Criminal Procedure Act, which provides that an accused is not criminally responsible for an act or omission which constitutes an offence if at the time of the commission of the alleged offence, the accused suffered from a mental illness or mental defect which rendered him or her either incapable of appreciating the wrongfulness of his or her act or of acting in accordance with an appreciation of the wrongfulness. The test for pathological criminal incapacity comprises of a pathological or biological leg, which entails that the accused should have suffered from a mental illness or mental defect at the time of the commission of the offence, and also a psychological leg, which entails that the accused should have, as a result of the mental illness or defect, lacked either the capacity of appreciating the wrongfulness of the act or of acting in accordance with such appreciation. The test is accordingly a so-called mixed test, in that both the pathological as well as the psychological factors are taken into account in determining whether an accused lacked criminal capacity. The threshold requirement for the defense of pathological incapacity is the existence of a mental illness or defect at the time of the commission of the act. This requirement is also referred to as the pathological leg or test for criminal responsibility. The mental illness or mental defect must in addition render the accused incapable of either appreciating the wrongfulness of the act or of acting in accordance with such appreciation. In respect of the defense of pathological criminal incapacity, it's important to note that certain mental illnesses may not necessarily affect an accused's capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his or her actions, but may nevertheless deprive the accused of the ability to control conduct or to act in accordance with such appreciation. The test for pathological criminal incapacity does not, however, define the terms mental illness or mental defect, nor does it specify the particular mental disorders that could constitute mental illness or mental defect for purposes of the defense. What becomes evidence is that the test only identifies the effects which should result from a particular mental illness or mental defect. The pivotal role of the mental health professional in the definition and assessment of mental illness becomes evident. A question which frequently arises is whether the definition of mental illness or mental defect should be a medical or a legal prerogative. Cervenko pertinently encapsulates this dilemma by stating that during the past 2 centuries, the courts have often said that the term disease of the mind or mental disease or defect is in the test of criminal responsibility is not a medical but a legal term. At the same time, however, since medical or psychiatric opinion is necessary to give meaning to the term, it becomes a fusion of legal and medical components. To be sure, no rule of law can be reliable when absolutely dependent on another discipline, but without input from other areas, the law would be just a mere verbal agonizing. In respect of expert evidence by mental health professionals, a court is obliged, in terms of Section 78(2) of the Criminal Procedure Act, to refer an accused for observation if it is alleged at criminal proceedings that an accused is by reason of mental illness or mental defect not criminally responsible, or if it appears to the court that an accused is not criminally responsible. The matter is then inquired into and reported on in accordance with Section 79 of the Criminal Procedure Act. Constructing a defense of pathological criminal incapacity due to a neurological dysfunction or disorder will accordingly entail firstly establishing a particular neurological disorder or brain dysfunction as a mental illness or mental defect for purposes of Section 78(1) as threshold requirement. It will then have to be established that such neurological disorder resulted in either the inability of the accused of appreciating the wrongfulness of his or her actions, in other words, the cognitive capacity, or the inability of acting in accordance with the appreciation of wrongfulness. If either the cognitive or the cognitive capacity of the accused was sufficiently impaired as a result of brain dysfunction or a neurological disorder, the accused is said to have lacked criminal capacity. Within the context of neuroscience and the role of neurological disorders in assessing criminal responsibility, various questions arise. As was gleaned from the discussion above, the defense of pathological criminal incapacity deals essentially with mental illness and or mental defect. The question which arises is whether a neurological disorder will qualify as a mental illness or mental defect for purposes of the defense of pathological criminal incapacity. A related issue pertains to this situation similar to the factual scenarios at the outset of this contribution. A typical example would be where an accused is, for example, temporarily incapacitated due to a brain disorder or neurological disorder. Once such disorder is healed, the accused will no longer suffer from the disorder, in which event the defense of pathological incapacity will no longer be feasible. In cases of frontal lobe disorder, it could be argued that the cognitive leg of the capacity will be affected. But once again, one is brought back to the question as to whether this will be encompassed by the definition of mental illness or mental defect. To date, no such cases have featured within South African criminal law. In addition, there have been no cases where the role of neuroscience in respect of criminal responsibility was addressed. A further question which arises is what role neuroscience can play in respect of impulse control disorders, which arose as a result of brain dysfunction. Neurological disorders will undoubtedly influence an accused's criminal capacity, but in most cases, probably not to the extent of satisfying the insanity criteria. It could be argued, as will be stated later, that diminished criminal responsibility would be a more sound alternative in terms of dealing with brain disorders. The latter does, however, not detract from the pivotal influence and role that neuroscience evidence can play in these cases, ultimately providing the court with a holistic view of the accused's mental state at the time of the offense. Then reflections on the scientific reliability and validity of neuroscientific evidence. One of the most frequently raised questions or criticism leveled towards scientific evidence, which in this address deals with neuroscientific evidence, relates to the scientific reliability and validity of the testimony provided by a scientific expert, which in this case will provide expert evidence pertaining to neuroscience and more specifically brain dysfunction or neurological disorders. It is from the outset important to note that reliability and validity are not synonyms, but refer to two distinct different concepts. According to Ennis and Litvak, reliability refers to the probability or of frequency of agreement when two or more independent observers answer the same question. Validity, on the other hand, refers to not to how likely psychiatrists are to agree about a particular judgment, but how accurate their judgments are. Another method of assessing the essential difference between reliability and validity is by defining reliability as denoting the degree of correlation or correspondence amongst professionals employing the same method, whereas validity denotes the degree of correlation or correspondence between the judgment derived at by professionals and some fact in the external world. The question which still needs to be addressed is whether set criteria should not be established in terms of which scientific reliability and validity can be assessed. It is tried that even where criteria are formulated in terms of reliability and validity, in terms of which reliability and validity can be measured, the application thereof will fluctuate as each case will present its own distinct characteristics. It is further important to bear in mind the divergent opinions which can ensue in respect of the mental state of an individual. Relative criteria will, however, assist the trier of fact in making a determination in respect of validity and reliability. One of the most influential American decisions relating to specifically scientific reliability and validity of expert evidence is the case of Daubert versus Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals. Regarding the questions of admissibility of expert scientific testimony, a three-staged approach was suggested, providing for the following. A trier of fact should first assess whether an expert presenting scientific evidence, whether an expert is presenting scientific evidence. A trier of fact then has to assess whether such evidence will be likely to assist the court to comprehend or ascertain a fact which is an issue in the trial. And to ensure that these two criteria are met, the trier of fact has to assess whether the reasoning or methodology underlying the testimony is scientifically valid and whether that reasoning or methodology can properly be applied to the facts in issue. Regarding the assessment of scientific reliability and validity of expert evidence, the Supreme Court outlined 4 factors to be considered as a contextual framework in terms of which reliability and validity can be assessed. These criteria consist of or constitute the following. In the first instance, for a theory or technique to constitute scientific knowledge, it should be established whether the theory or technique can be tested, or ideally has been tested. Secondly, a court should ascertain as to whether the theory or technique has been subjected to peer review and publication. Although publication does not ensure evidentiary reliability, it becomes relevant as it indicates that the knowledge has been subjected to the scrutiny of other experts in the field, which inadvertently increases the likelihood that problems in the knowledge would have been detected. It was recommended that trial courts have due regard to the known or potential error rate for the knowledge and standards prescribing the manner in which the technique is to be applied. It should also be determined whether the methodology is generally accepted in the relevant scientific community where similar concepts are applied. It was noted that these factors should be considered pertaining to the question of scientific validity with reference to specific context of issues raised in a specific case. Factors such as vigorous cross-examination, opposing evidence, and due consideration of the burden of proof were held to be adequate to deal with insufficient scientific evidence presented at a particular trial. Carson and Bull elaborate on an important aspect enunciated in Daubert, the principle of causation, which could also be useful pertaining to expert testimony in cases where neuroscientific evidence is presented. It is important to distinguish between general causation from specific causation. General causation refers to the assertion that one factor can produce particular results, whereas specific causation refers to those factors having had those results pertaining to the specific case before the court. Within the context of criminal incapacity, for example, and more specifically pathological criminal incapacity, the general causation will denote whether mental illness such as schizophrenia, for example, can induce a particular result, whereas specific causation will entail whether schizophrenia had or produced those results in a specific case before the court. The dichotomy of general and specific causation is prevalent in almost all forms of scientific evidence and could also feature in neuroscientific evidence. To date, there has been no decision where the scientific reliability and validity of neuroscientific evidence was addressed. It is, however, submitted that the criteria deduced from Daubert could become useful in terms of assessing the scientific reliability and validity of neuroscientific evidence. Then the risks and limitations of neuroscientific evidence. It remains an undeniable fact that despite the significant advancements which neuroscience has made in terms of explaining criminal behaviors, it is still relatively novel, which will inevitably result in a multifaceted challenge in terms of the presentation of such evidence in criminal trials. As indicated above, there has to date been no cases in South African criminal law where neuroscientific evidence was introduced in support of either exoneration or mitigation or aggravation of sentence. It is accordingly essential to take a closer look at some of the limitations associated with the presentation of neuroscientific evidence. Scientific challenges. The cerebral imagery technique most frequently utilized at present is the functional magnetic resonance imagery, or more commonly referred to as the fMRI, as stated above earlier in this discussion. Despite huge advancements, neuroimagery techniques and concomitantly fMRI have encountered certain challenges, which could present challenges during the presentation of neuroscientific evidence in courts. Coetzee and Gasser note that images forthcoming from fMRI are more often than not viewed as photographs of the brain, but fMRI images provide an indirect presentation of brain activity. The underlying principle of fMRI is the use of variations in the oxygen of blood during behavioral activity in order to locate the activated regions of the brain. As such, modifications in the state of oxygenation of the hemoglobin in the red corpuscles are viewed, resulting in variations in magnetic properties. fMRI accordingly measures fluctuations in the magnetic field brought about due to an increase in blood flow and does not therefore measure brain activity. Coetzee and Gasser in addition expressed the following word of caution. When fMRI results are used in court, it is essential for the different protagonists in a trial to understand that fMRI-derived images do not afford direct access to empirical data at a precise moment in time, as in the case, for example, with radiography of cerebral activity. The final images result from a series of processing steps and statistical analyses performed on the data. The intensive use of statistics in fMRI techniques can generate errors, and the statistics implemented are often a source of uncertainty. A further challenge relates to the fact that neuropsychological data differ substantially in brain anatomy across individuals, and as such, high variables in individual brain structures is considered to be a major obstacle in attempting to apply the results from a group of individuals to a single subject, which could provide challenges in a legal setting. It is of importance to bear in mind that fMRI images provide a qualitative analysis, dependent essentially on the interpretation of the results. As such, researchers assess which information derived from neuron activity of the brain might be crucial in assessing the cognitive functioning and generally the mental state of the individual. fMRI techniques generate results on group or at group level, whereas within the legal setting, an individual result is essential. In terms of correlation between brain structure and psychological functioning, Coetzee and Gasser note that fMRI is a method that can show correlations but not causality links between a brain region and cognitive or psychological functions. Judges often make the mistake of interpreting neuroimagery data as objective evidence of mental illness by assuming that the diagnosis of the illness can be made on the basis of the brain images. However, although neuroimagery can today assist in diagnosis of neurological and psychiatric illnesses, no such study has been able to show a causal relationship between certain anomalies in brain structure or function and a particular mental illness. Medico-legal challenges. It was indicated in this address that neuroscientific evidence will have to support admissibility and reliability requirements. As such, the scientific reliability and probative value of neuroscientific evidence remains a challenge, as neuroscientific tests need to be interpreted by experts, and the presiding judge will have to assess the scientific validity and reliability of such interpretation. From a substantive criminal law perspective, we are concerned with the mental state of an accused at the time of the commission of the crime. Neuroimagery tests are performed after the accused had committed the offence, and it's important to bear in mind that reconstructing what took place in an accused's brain at the time of the incident is challenging. fMRI as such holds no diagnostic or predictive value for the emergence of deviant behaviours. Goetze and Gasser further note that the criteria for concluding to the penal responsibility of the accused or to diminished penal responsibility or acquittal are clearly defined legal notions within each legal framework and legal system. Thus, a neurobiological explanation of a behavior exhibited by an offender in the same way as any other causal explanation is not in itself a reason for diminishing legal responsibility or excusing the offence. At best, it can provide supplementary evidence, which, when taken into consideration along with all other aspects of each case, could help to ascertain whether there is an excuse in legal terms. It is submitted that despite the challenges and obstacles in the wake of neuroscience entering the courtroom guides, it could be used to supplement other evidence in order to place the court in a better position to either assess criminal responsibility or to consider mitigating or aggravating factors for purposes of sentencing. The presentation of neuroscientific evidence in order to assess criminal responsibility as such presents South African criminal law with a multifaceted challenge. Neuroscience has made great strides in establishing correlates between neurological or brain dysfunctions and criminal behavior. An issue which arises is the question as to what role this evidence would be in respect of multiple defences in South African criminal law. It is thought that in a neurological dysfunction, for example, a brain tumour or even epilepsy, which was not yet diagnosed, can lead to an involuntary action, in which event the accused would not have acted for purposes of South African criminal law, provided the neurological disorder caused the involuntary act. In such an event, the accused will be exonerated. The more complex situation where neuroscience could play a role is in respect of the defence of pathological criminal incapacity. It was noted that the threshold requirement for this defence relates to the existence at the time of the offence of a mental illness or mental defect which caused the accused to either lack cognitive or cognitive capacities. The problem which arises is that a brain disorder will not qualify as a mental illness or mental defect necessarily, albeit that it's quite clear that such disorder could impact on either cognitive or cognitive capacities of an accused at the time of the commission of a crime. A related issue relates to the situation where an accused person suffered from a brain tumour, for example, at the time of the crime, which is later healed as a result of neurological intervention. In such case, the accused will not be mentally ill, as required in terms of Section 78(1). Neuroscientific evidence will, in addition, as stated, have to establish that the neurological disposition was the cause of the incapacity at the time of the crime. Neuroscientific evidence will further have to pass scientific reliability and validity tests in order to be admissible in whichever capacity it is adduced. Diminished criminal capacity is a more plausible option. South African criminal law does not as yet have a specific defence of diminished criminal responsibility or capacity. The principle of diminished criminal capacity or responsibility is, however, enshrined in Section 78(7) of the Criminal Procedure Act, and in essence provides that if a court finds that an accused person was criminally responsible, but his or her capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of the act or to act in accordance with such appreciation was diminished as a result of the mental illness or mental defect, the court shall have regard to such diminished responsibility during sentencing. A person may very well suffer from a mental illness or defect, but must still be able to appreciate the wrongfulness of his or her act or to act in accordance with such appreciation, albeit that one of these capacities was severely diminished at the time of the commission of the crime. Diminished criminal responsibility will not exonerate an accused, but will serve in the mitigation of sentence. It is submitted that the role of neuroscientific evidence at present will probably be best suited when advanced in support of mitigation of punishment. It could be argued that due to a neurological or brain dysfunction, an accused's cognitive or cognitive capacities were impaired. It could be argued that legislative intervention is needed within the framework of Section 78, as discussed earlier in this presentation, in order to provide for other disorders and concomitantly providing for the adducement of other scientific evidence other than psychiatric and or psychological evidence. The latter could aid both the prosecution and defence in presenting the cases more comprehensively and accurately. In conclusion, it remains an undeniable reality that the field of neuroscience has evolved drastically of late. Research clearly indicates that there are correlates between brain dysfunction and criminal behaviour. To date, there has been no decided criminal case law in South Africa where neuroscientific evidence was assessed. It remains to be seen in future whether this evidence will feature, and if so, to what extent it will have probative value and be admitted. Law and medicine have one common denominator. They are both inexact sciences in a constant state of evolution. As such, it is submitted that courts should be more receptive to hearing such evidence, even if only to add to other evidence in order to place the court in a better position to adjudicate on issues relating to criminal responsibility. It should by no means usurp the function of the trier of fact. At the end of the day, the Constitution of South Africa, in terms of Section 35(3), grants every accused person the right to adduce and challenge evidence. Only when all relevant and admissible evidence have been placed before the court and have been thoroughly tested under cross-examination can it truly be said that justice has been served. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this 50-minute discussion. I want to thank each and every one of you who attended here tonight. Firstly, I want to thank the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Professor Duncan, for the opportunity to present this inaugural address and for all your guidance before this address. Professor Elsabe Skuman, Dean, thank you for your support and for everything, for always being there. My HOD, Professor Diani Mangu, thank you for always supporting me with everything. In the short time that I've come to know you, you've been an inspiration, and I want to thank you for everything you do for me in the department. My colleagues from the Department of Public Law, thank you for attending this. Also my colleague who is not here tonight but is viewing it through live stream, Professor Peter Carstens. I want to thank him for everything that he's done for me in my career and development and everything. And also my family who is present tonight, my amazing father and sister who are present. Thank you for everything, all the love and support. And also today is a very special date. It's also the birthday of my late mother. And as such, I would also like to honor her legacy in terms of this inaugural address. This inaugural address is also dedicated to my family and my sister, my parents and my sister, for always being there. My friends who are here tonight, who have probably now diagnosed me with prefrontal cortex problems, thank you for attending this for me. I'll let everyone that are here tonight. Thank you. That's all I can say. My heart is warm seeing everyone here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Stevens, for an interesting and thought-provoking address, seeking to advance an area of criminal law beyond the strict boundaries of the law, so to speak. Professor Stevens' inaugural address focused on the interaction between neuroscience and law, also coined neurolaw, which concerns the interplay between the legal system and advancements made within the field of neuroscience. In this context, neuroscience deals with the human brain and seeks to enhance the understanding of how human behavior and also criminal behavior are influenced by the brain. As such, Professor Stevens addressed the emerging nature of neuroscience in South African criminal law, with specific reference to its applicability to different levels of criminal liability. He pointed out that neuroscience has advanced to the level where it is increasingly being used to explain an offender's mental state, or alternatively, to assess potential future dangerousness, a new term but I learned, and therefore it has the potential to inform on certain aspects which fall outside the normal mental health assessment model in order to better comprehend criminal behavior. Indeed, neuroscience can supplement forensic, psychiatric, and psychological evidence in criminal trials. Professor Stevens shared fascinating examples of cases where physical injury to the brain resulted in antisocial and/or criminal behavior. In this regard, it has been observed that numerous systems of antisocial personality disorder are consistent with the symptoms of frontal lobe dysfunction. Similarly, the development of psychopathy may in selected cases be traced to frontal lobe damage early in life. It is also notable that the frontal lobes contain the brain's primary serotonergic projections and, as such, abnormalities in serotonin metabolism may lead to impulsive aggression. Importantly, he cautions that while it is easy to denounce the evildoer, it is of critical importance to also strive to understand the evildoer. This is important, and it is often overlooked, yet it is of critical importance in ensuring justice in criminal trials. While it is true that neuroscience has made significant inroads in terms of explaining criminal behavior, it is still relatively new and will inevitably result in multifaceted challenge in the presentation of such evidence in criminal trials. There has to date not been any cases in South African criminal law where neuroscientific evidence was introduced in support of either exoneration or mitigation or aggravation of sentence. It is therefore a new and developing area of law that is eminently suited to transdisciplinary research collaborations. Professor Stevens is well placed to advance this research, having laid the foundation for its development in South African criminal law tonight in his inaugural address. And I'm looking forward to seeing him embrace this challenge and put UP law at the forefront of this cutting-edge research. I would like to congratulate Professor Stevens on an excellent inaugural address. You have demonstrated that by breaking down the silos and working across disciplines, we are able to find better grounded and well-informed solutions to some of our biggest challenges and ultimately to achieve justice in the true sense of the word. I think we've seen more signs than we've ever did in the law faculty before tonight. As a valued member of the Faculty of Law, I wish you all the best with your future research endeavors. I would like to thank everyone who attended this special event tonight, in person and virtually. Your participation is sincerely appreciated. A special word of thanks to Professor Duncan for officiating tonight and for introducing Professor Stevens and welcoming him and his loved ones. Professor Duncan, I believe this is your final official appearance at an inaugural lecture, and we are very honored that that happened in the law faculty. It is now my pleasure to invite the audience present, unfortunately those online cannot join us, to enjoy refreshments in the foyer. Good night, and please take care. Thank you.
Well,